Hi guys, and welcome back to Drukhari 101. Today we're going to be talking about sub-factions and how to help you choose the right sub-factions for your Drukhari army. I'm going to think about the Cabals, the Witch Cults, and the Coven. I'm going to think about this mainly in an introductory way, okay? We'll talk about what sort of competitive and suitable for competitive play options are there, focusing primarily on what the sub-factions give you in terms of their traits, but also their stratagems. We're going to think about relics and warlords and other things in a separate instalment, particularly on characters, so I'm not going to do that today. But the idea here is to give you a general sense of what your options are and how you can build your Drukhari army. Obviously, the choice we get with our sub-factions is enormous. It's one of the massive strengths of the book, so I really encourage you to experiment, try different sub-factions, and see how you go. But yeah, there's a lot to get into here, so we're going to start with the Cabals. So, the Cabals. You have 4 named Cabal options in the book: Blackheart, Poisoned Tongue, Obsidian Rose, and Flayed Skull. There are custom Cabal options, but none of them are really very intuitive or obvious for beginners and new players, and none of them really see competitive use, so I'm going to take you through these. First and foremost, I think the most popular Cabal by some distance is Blackheart. And what Blackheart gives you is it gives all of your Drukhari Cabal units and mercenaries one round further along of Power from Pain, so they hit those key stages of Power from Pain quicker. They have Advance and Charge in turn 1. They have sort of buffs to hit quicker. They have therefore 5-up invuln in turn 3 instead of turn 4. Lots of nice little things. It's particularly good on vehicles because the vehicles can Advance and Charge turn 1, which is great on raiders and venoms and that sort of thing. But the other thing that Blackhearts gives you is 1 reroll to hit every time you shoot or fight with a unit, which again is massively powerful. Really nice on blasters, on dark lances, makes your accuracy much better. And finally, the other thing they give you is access to the stratagem Agents of Vect. Agents of Vect costs you nothing to use. It's a once per game stratagem, and you use it when an opponent uses a stratagem. And from then on out, not this time, but every other time after that, it's going to cost your opponent an additional CP on top of the normal price for them to be able to use that stratagem again. This is a massively powerful tool. You can use it on things like Interrupt in melee, massively useful. You could use it on things like Transhuman Physiology, anything you think your opponent is going to want to use several times and you want to try and price them out of being able to use, or just make it more painful for them to use it, then Agents of Vect is an incredibly powerful stratagem. And the fact that it doesn't cost you anything is absolutely amazing. So it's not a surprise that we see Blackheart used all the time. I think it's a really powerful set of things and well worth exploring. Next up, Poisoned Tongue. I really like Poisoned Tongue for a couple of reasons. The main thing they give you is +1 to wound with your poisoned weapons. So that's really nice on things like splinter cannons, on venoms, or on the sort of splinter rifles of your Trueborn. Into some armies it makes them extremely nasty, things like demons where there's big monsters that don't want to be wounded on 3s. It's really, really good. But the other thing Poisoned Tongue gives you is a 2 CP stratagem that enables you to redeploy forces after you know the turn order, who's going first, who's going second. So you can move up to 3 units on the board, or you can put them back into strategic reserves. This has massive tactical application, gives you the opportunity to counter deploy, to trick the opponent by deploying stuff on one side and then refuse flanking to deploy on the other side. It lets you bring stuff into reserves if you're worried that your opponent's shooting going first is going to wipe out things like Ravagers or Raiders that you need to keep alive. So it offers you a lot of tactical flexibility. I think Poisoned Tongue doesn't cut through quite as often because Raiders have been more popular than Venoms, but also a lot of stuff in the game now has only wounded on a 4-up or -1 to wound, etc. that kind of negates the trait. Nonetheless, I think there's a lot to be done with Poisoned Tongue, and I think the redeploy in particular can really lend itself to some very clever and sneaky deployment plays early on as well. Well worth a look. Obsidian Rose. Now, Obsidian Rose is a really nice one if you're doing a sort of ranged Cabalite build, and I've run lists that lean into this quite a lot before. You get 1 reroll to wound, where Blackheart have a reroll to hit. This is really good with Drukhari if you're up against things that are toughness 8, like Knights, for example, because that's where things like Dark Lances, which are strength 8, suddenly don't wound quite as efficiently as they normally would. So being able to re-roll a wound can be really clutch for getting that extra bit of damage through on a knight, or something particularly tough and scary. Plague Burst Crawler's another good example. But the other thing Obsidian Rose gives you is +6 inches to a lot of your ranged weapons. And that's really nice on Trueborn with their blasters going to 24 inches. It's very nice if you're running lots of Cabalites with blaster weapons, but it also means that your Dark Lances are essentially impossible to avoid. You're talking 42-inch Dark Lance range is absolutely massive. So that's where Obsidian Rose is really powerful, I think, as a sort of shooting Cabalite blaster and Dark Lance heavy build. It can lend itself really nicely to that. Finally, Flayed Skull. Now, Flayed Skull was my favourite in 8th edition. It was fantastic. And it is still good in some ways, but it's probably the weakest of the 4 named ones. What it gives you is it gives you a +1 to movement on your vehicles, and it gives you the ability to ignore cover firing from vehicles as well. Neither of these are as strong as they used to be with the smaller board, and with the way cover is used being less consistent. What Flayed Skull do have that's nice is a stratagem which gives you +1 to hit against something with fly, or +2 to hit against an aircraft. So if you're doing a sort of gunboat or airplane heavy build and you want that extra accuracy to take out your opponent's armour or take out opponent flyers, the stratagem for that is really good. Unfortunately, it's just not quite enough to give it sort of weight or viability as compared to other things, although I think some lists that go heavy on Venoms and use the extra speed to just fly all over the place have done okay. With Flayed Skull. It's one that I'd like to see people experiment with, but perhaps doesn't have some of the immediate power and all-round application of its friends. So those are your options for the Cabals, guys. I think, as I say, I think you can have a good time building into using any of those, and it is worth saying that the Flayed Skull strat for +1 to hit would be great on a Tantalus, with all of its guns, great big sort of heavy support option, so that's something maybe to try. But those are the sort of the 4 key ways in which to play Cabal. So now we shall move on to think about the sub-factions available to you as a Witch Cult player. So, Witch Cults. I'm going to speak from my own experience here. My understanding is that some people use custom Witch Cults a little bit these days, but I haven't done that, so I'm not going to pretend that I know how that works. Instead, I'm going to talk to you about the 3 main Witch Cults that are available. That's Cult of Strife, Red Grief, and Cult of the Cursed Blade. Now, Cult of Strife has an unfair advantage on the others in terms of power because it got a whole supplement in the Book of Rust when that came out, which has a whole suite of extra stratagems, a whole suite of extra relics, which merits exploration in its own video. And so I'm going to come back and do Cult of Strife themed video in the future. But it's worth saying it's also just a very powerful sub-faction to take in general. It gets you a fight again stratagem for witches. Witches are great in melee. Being able to fight again with them is really nice. But it also gives you fight first in the fight phase, which is really powerful, especially if you start trapping things and then you're getting to fight ahead of them in their phase when they can't escape from your witches. So that can be extremely powerful, but also you get +1 to charge when you're charging a unit that doesn't currently have any of your units in combat with it. So that means witches coming in from Deep Strike can be charging on an 8, re-rolling, which can be really useful. But it also just gives you that little bit of reach to get your Succubi and Hellions and other aggressive units where they need to go. So Cult of Strife is straightforwardly a very powerful thing, lends itself very well to the sort of total shutdown style of play that mass witch cults are trying to pull off, and obviously does get you all the extra stuff from the Book of Rust that we'll talk about another day as well. My personal favourite is Cult of the Cursed Blade. This is something I've experimented with in the past quite a lot. And there's a specific Cursed Blade sort of character succubus build you can do that we'll talk about in a different video, but it's essentially a sort of a little grenade character that goes in and kills herself but takes something much bigger with her, but that's one for another day. The most important thing with Cursed Blade is that you get +1 strength across the board. This is amazing on Hellions, it's amazing on Reavers, and it's good on Witches, because what it does is it frees you up to use your combat drugs on witches to buff other things, whether that's movement or toughness. I particularly like toughness because suddenly you've got strength 5, toughness 5, Hellions and Reavers flying around, which is really, really nice. And what Cursed Blade is good for is having a set of buffs that just make your witches better without requiring CP investment. Cult of Strife is great, but everything that makes it good involves you losing CP, and losing CP very, very quickly, because you're paying for extra stratagems, you're paying for extra relics, you're paying for extra traits. If you want to sort of plug in your witches into, say, a real space raid or something like that, and just have them be better at what they do without paying additional CP for it, Curse Blade can be really very good. And the added toughness on witches goes a long way, because they are extremely fragile. So anything which lets you buff up their toughness without negatively impacting their damage output too much is really, really nice. The other effect Curse Blade gets is that it bounces back mortal wounds on 6s to save, and with your 6-up in-run you always get a 6 to save, and this is in melee only. And so that's really nice. Those add up over time. You chip away at the opponent, particularly going into elite things like Terminators. You really, really slowly take the enemy down with you with your cheap, cheerful witches and tying things up. So it's an interesting one, and it works quite well. Can be a lot of fun. Finally, Red Grief. Now, I think Red Grief has actually got quite enormous application as a sort of utility trait. Okay, if you're looking to use your witches for harassment, to tie things up, to make trouble, to move block, or just a couple of little assassination sort of characters, Red Grief is really powerful. What this gives you is +2 to advance, and the ability to reroll charges. So from turn 2, once you're advancing and charging, suddenly the threat range on your witches, which is already considerable, becomes absolutely enormous. It combines really well with Hypex, which is a combat drug that gives things +2 movement. So you can have witches that are effectively on a +4 movement, usually with a base movement of 8+, just absolutely YOLOing across the board and getting stuck into things, or flying into corridors and blocking off things like dreadnoughts, stopping them moving where they want to go, flying and tagging objectives so your opponent can't put banners up on them. My favourite is little squads of Reavers going and harassing units that you know are there to deploy scramblers, things like cultists or crusaders, little units that have, if they don't do their job in the first couple of turns, suddenly they're actually causing the opponent a real problem. You can just sling some Reavers in that can go an incredible distance, stacked up to huge move distances, 30-ish sort of movement plus, and re-rolling charges. Reavers tooled up with the Red Grief strats are really nice. And so the Red Grief stratagem lets you fight and get back in a transport. You don't tend to see this used because your transports will end up being Black Heart, and it needs a Red Grief transport. And this is one of some of the problems with some of the Witch Cult stratagems, is that they're just not quite as universally applicable or reliable as some of the other tools that are in the main book. But that's Red Grief. As I say, I've enjoyed using all 3 of these. I think Strife, with the extra things it unlocks, understandably, is what people come back to, but you can genuinely build some really nice lists using both of the others, and the other 2 don't cost you as much CP or require as much additional investment. So it's worth thinking about what you want your witches to do. If you want all-round melee brawlers that are a bit tougher, Curse Blade is great. If you want real precision and shutdown and a suite of additional tools, Cult of Strife is great. And if you want very speedy harassment, then Red Grief in particular is nice. And it's worth saying the Red Grief Bloodglaive relic is also really good, but we'll talk about that when we think about Succubi characters another day. So that's the Witch Cults. We're going to move on to think about the Coven. So, Coven. This is an interesting one. Coven are the only ones where, certainly in competitive play and high level play, 2 of the custom traits, the all-consuming ones, the ones you can only pick 1 of and then that's it, are by far the most powerful traits that they've got. The 3 other named Covens are actually really good in their own ways and have some really interesting tricks and tools, so we'll talk about it, but it would be wrong not to recognise the sheer power of the 2 custom Covens. So the first one, and the most popular one at the moment, is Artists of Flesh. This is a -1 damage across the board, and you're talking about units that already have an Invuln, already have a Feel No Pain, already have boosted toughness and healing with a Homunculus around. -1 damage put onto things like Racks, put onto things like Grotesques, put onto things like Talos is really, really good, and gives you an enormous amount of staying power, which Drukhari desperately need, because not much else that you have will stay alive for very long, and is a really good counter to Mass Damage 2, Mass Damage 3, and Mortal Wounds heavy armies, of which there are many out there. The other predominant Coven's trait is Dark Technomancers. Now this has undergone some changes since it first came out, because it was broken as hell when it first landed, but essentially this lets you overcharge Coven ranged weapons. meaning you get +1 to wound and +1 damage, and you take mortal wounds on 1s to hit, which you can't reroll. Now this gets you some nice output out of things like ossifactors and hex rifles, but its main use is on the Kronos, which is the pain engine with a little flamer thing, and you can overcharge the flamer. So it's a very, very powerful way of getting some nice high AP damage out of your ranged weapons for Coven. It doesn't work on liquefier guns anymore, and that's for the best. So those are your sort of competitive ones. But I think as a new player or someone starting to try Coven, it would be well worth exploring the main named Coven. So I'm going to take you through broadly what they do. The main one is Prophets of Flesh. What that gives you is a sort of mini transhuman style effect on your units, so they can't be wounded on 1s, 2s and 3s except by weapons of sort of strength 8 or higher. So that helps to protect things like racks against small arms fire and limits your opponent's damage, and your monsters and bigger things heal 1 wound per turn as well. Prophets also get a stratagem which gives you rerolls to hit, full rerolls to hit, which Coven already have a general stratagem for rerolls to wound, so you combine these two together and you can massively increase the damage output in melee of your troops as well. And there's some nice options here for relics as well, which we'll touch when we come to characters in the next episode. There's also the Coven of 12. Now, Coven of 12 are actually my favourite, especially to run casually and narratively, because they just have a really nice range of tools. The first thing they get is +1 AP on all weapons. That's lovely. A lot of your Coven is AP1, especially things like racks. If you take them to AP2 and then AP3 on 6s to wound, suddenly they're actually really nice at getting through a lot of different opponents and a lot of different tools, particularly power armour. So that's always a nice thing to have. The other thing they gain is the ability to shoot whilst performing actions. This is really nice on racks, if you want racks to be putting banners up or scrambling whilst also putting some range pressure on the opponent. It's really nice, really worth doing. This is the only Coven where you can also build a sort of melee-centric homunculus with some fun traits and tools, so that's really worth having a look at if you want to have a sort of combat homunculus. And their stratagem gives you a way of doing mortal wounds with a homunculus in melee, which helps him do his job even better as well. So Coven of 12 is my niche pick, all-round pick, going more for damage than for resilience. And finally we've got Dark Creed. Now I tried to use Dark Creed a lot early on in the edition, and there's something here. They combo well with lots of other little tricks that Drukhari can do around leadership, because they give you a -1 leadership aura around your units, and they also give you +1 to hit against things that you have greater leadership than, which is most things thanks to the aura. So they're more accurate in melee, and they have that leadership debuff, which helps you with other units, things like Incubi, Drazar, Phantasm, grenade launchers, all sorts of things that benefit from your opponent having their leadership reduced. But the nicest thing with Dark Creed is they get a stratagem which lets a unit shoot at a character and ignore Lookout Sir. Now at the right moment, this could be absolutely huge. If you just have a full Talos squad with sort of Heat Lances, or a Kronos unit with Flamers, just absolutely punking an enemy character, that can be really funny and can definitely catch the opponent out as well. So Dark Creed have some use. I like all three of these. I think you get different kinds of use out of them than the sort of straightforward resilience or power of the two custom traits, but there's definitely something there, and they're all well worth experimenting. So hopefully that gives you a rough overview of what the sorts of things being offered to you by the different sub-factions are. I don't think you can make a bad Drukhari list picking across these traits. I think you can always find something interesting or useful in the sub-faction trait that you decide you want to work with, and I really encourage you to try and experiment with all of them. See what kinds of things you benefit from, see what kinds of units you get the best out of trying the different traits and building into different ways of doing it. And it's going to be particularly fun, I think, to do a real space raid and I'm just going to try these 3 different sub-factions and see what I get on. What would a real space raid battalion look like using these things? So get out there, let me know what you find and what you find most effective. I'm really interested to see how you will get on. And I'll join you next time, where we're going to think about how you can build some very nasty Drukhari characters to take the fight to the enemy. Stay safe out there, and see you soon.